right, now then everyone. A second, wrong button. And right, so now then everyone, I decided that I actually hate the title that I gave this talk, so I thought I'll start this talk off instead with a nice warm now then, because I mean, who doesn't love this? And this is a photo a friend sent me from Sheffield recently. I think it's safe to say that, here in Hull, we need to step up our game if, we need to be welcoming people to the city with this. Anyway, who am I? So I am David Warrington, and I work at Shopify. I've been working at Shopify for the last 2.5 years, and my role at Shopify is Senior Demo Engineer. So most people I talk to don't really know what a demo engineer is. So to give you a bit of context, the primary role of my team is engaging with enterprise merchants who are looking at coming onto the platform, but they all have their own bespoke custom workflows. So we prove for them that they can use our APIs to extend the platform and have whatever flows they like. But then, whilst doing this, we also started building some internal tooling. And when we're building demos, we're not too worried about the quality of the code that we're writing, because once a demo's been shown, no one's ever going to look at it again. But the internal tooling we really do care about. We want to build something high quality because there are thousands of people working at Shopify, and some of our internal tooling is now part of the onboarding experience at Shopify. So we have hundreds of people using our tools every day, and they all work alongside us. They know exactly who builds the tools, and if anything goes wrong, they know where to point their fingers. So I wanted to talk today about validation. So this is just an example of some manual validation. Maybe you don't write JavaScript, but who here is, hands up, who's done a regular type-of check before in their code? Yeah, I would imagine most of you have, simple as. Next up, who's done something a bit more complex? Maybe you just had to check that the length of a string is between two values. Yeah? Now, I promise my talk isn't just going to be a string of these questions. But now, who's gone this far where you need to validate an array suddenly? So you start off by calling array.isArray. I think, yeah, most of us have. Now, my hand is up for this one. Who here has got to this point and thought, yeah, fuck it. If somebody sent me an array, I'm just going to assume that it's got the right data in it. Yeah, if anybody hasn't put their hand up here, then I'm going to assume it's because you're with your boss today and you don't want to admit it. I see developers do this all the time, and I know that developers do this all the time. I was fighting with my Pi agent yesterday as I caught it doing this. So, why does this happen? We always hear about validation issues. People always have horror stories about them. And I think the primary reason it happens is because when we're asked to do work, we're always asked to do the happy path. Our stakeholders, whether it be our client, our boss, our team lead, what they're interested in is, in this example, they're interested in, can my user sign up to my site? It's a requirement from us that, it's our responsibility to know that we need to do some validation here, but at the end of the day, the people who our work is going to be shown to, they're not really thinking about this. So over time, validation issues start to slip through the cracks. And just to give you an example of what can happen, it's definitely not the most serious example out there, but would anybody here be interested in some free Domino's? Now, okay, it's not too much excitement about that. I appreciate it, it's Domino's. But about 10 years ago, a guy, I believe he's called Paul Price, discovered a way to get free Domino's pizza through the app because of a validation error. So he was looking at the app and he was thinking, how come every time I place an order, immediately afterwards I get a discount code? Is this something that's already on my phone and I can use that when I actually place the order? So he set up a proxy, started watching the network, and he noticed that when he hit submit on the checkout, his payment details went straight to the payment gateway. They didn't go through Domino's servers. They thought, that's interesting. They've taken a shortcut there. Might not be the end of the world, but maybe this is something I can play around with. And when he put some test data in here, used the visa 42424242, and it came back saying that this wasn't an authorized payment, which this is what you'd expect. This was good for Domino's. They disabled test payments. But then he noticed that that data was then sent to Domino's servers from his phone, saying that the payment was unauthorized. So he thought, okay, well, why don't I try modifying this and just modify the response to say that the payment was authorized? And what do you know? About half an hour later, he was sat in his living room enjoying some pizza that he hadn't paid for. Now, fortunately for Domino's, he did disclose this. But the reason that this happened is because of a validation failure on Domino's end. They were trusting that any data that's coming from their user's phone is something that is trustworthy. They received a transaction ID from his phone, but they weren't checking with the payment gateway, did this transaction actually succeed? So I want to talk today about making validation a bit easier using, and I apologize for this, Ryan, but using a JavaScript library. So I wanted to talk about a library that I've kind of fallen in love with called Zod, and we're going to look a bit at the ecosystem as well. So Zod, what it allows us to do is write schemas to describe the kind of data that we're expecting. Now, schemas in validation aren't anything new, but there are a few different validation libraries that are sort of new and modern in the Node ecosystem. So for anybody who doesn't know, this is what a schema might look like. So you can see here I'm expecting an object with these 3 properties, each of which is a string. My username needs to be between 2 and 20 characters. My password needs to include a number, and it needs to include a special character. And for now, I'm just going to say that my confirm password field is also going to be a string. So the benefit of a schema here is that it's very compact. I'm encoding a lot of information in my schema in a very small number of lines of code. And it's also readable. I'm sure everybody here can guess what this is describing, and I'm sure that actually from this you can guess if I needed a field that was a number, how I might actually use Zod to do that. And it's also shareable. So when we describe our data with schemas, we're defining it ahead of time. We're defining our expectations ahead of time, and rather than guessing our data and then running it through a bunch of if conditions, we can define our schema anywhere and we can reuse it across our code. So if we want, maybe we have an endpoint on our server where users can sign up through a REST endpoint, and then maybe we actually want to implement this schema on a front end. We can do this, we can use it in both places. And schemas, well, Zod schemas at least, are also shareable in terms of they can be used within each other. So, I can't really think of an example why I'd want to do it with a register schema, but I could embed this within another one. And then one of the things that I really like about Zod is that it's TypeScript first. So hands up here who uses TypeScript day to day? A good chunk of you. So the thing I really like about Zod is, it's TypeScript first. What I mean by that, first of all, is that it's type safe. So TypeScript knows that if anything comes through this schema and passes validation, it knows exactly what shape that data has from my description up here. But it's also TypeScript first in terms of it uses the language of TypeScript. So for those of you who use TypeScript day to day, you'll still be using tuples, unions, things like that within Zod. So this is just a very basic implementation of how you'd actually use the schema once you've got it. So this is in like a very small post request handler. I'm just calling this .parse method and passing my data through. I don't want to give you a basic tutorial on how to use Zod because it is relatively simple, but you can do some quite advanced stuff with it, and that's the fun stuff that I actually want to get to. So let's now talk about refinements. This is one of the more advanced things. So you might notice here that I have another bit of validation towards the bottom of my handler, comparing my password and confirm password field. This is like a bespoke validation. Zod can't really build an API for checking, maybe it could with comparing 2 fields, but it can't build an API for checking everything that we need to validate ahead of time. So refinements is an API that comes with Zod that allows us to do those more custom things. And so what we can do with this is move that check into the refine method. Because it's a bespoke validation, if that function returns false, we're going to define our own custom error message. And then if we really want to, we can customize it further and maybe assign that error message to the confirm password field. You can do what you want there. Next up, transformations. So this is actually something that I think is quite closely tied to validation, but not something that you necessarily think about straight away. So one of the issues that we have when it comes to validating our users' data is that over the network, they can't send us data in exactly the format that we want. For example, if we have a booking form here and we've got a date, they can't send us a JavaScript date object. So usually we ask them to encode it in a string format of some description. And what we can do here is we can do a transformation called a pre-process, which allows us to transform our data before we validate it. So here's an implementation, what that might look like, where we're just throwing a value into the date constructor, and then we pass it to z.date to validate that that is a date. But that's also built into Zod because things like converting things to date are really common, so they're just built into the library. It provides this coerce API. And you might also have noticed that I had guests as well, so if I'm handling form data, I can't get numbers from my forms, so I need to coerce that to a number too. Next up, we have transforming data after we've validated it. So often we receive data from our users, but it's not really in a usable format. We want to convert it to something else afterwards. This is an example, a really common thing where people, they want to send us a list of tags, and for some reason, rather than sending us an array, they put it into a string, join all the strings with commas. We can validate that we've received a string from them, and then just split it. Another example, this actually came up at work last week, where we're receiving a date from somebody, but when we actually use that date later in our code, what we're interested in is events that happen on that date as well. So we want to set that date to the last millisecond of the date, just to be inclusive. And then finally, this was inspired by an API I used to have to work with when I was building Shopify stores a lot. So there's a wishlist app, and I can only guess that they hated their users, or at least developers, building with their app, because they had this public API, and when you had a product in the wish list, it would have properties like EPI, DU, and PR, which don't really make any sense, or at least not to me. So what you could do is actually use a transform to make the data more usable for you at the time. And here we have an example where I'm just relabeling those bits of data after I've validated them. And I don't have a slide for this, but there is also another API in Zod called Codex, which allow you to do bidirectional transformations. So what you could do in this instance is set up a codex, say when I receive the data from my wish list, I need you to convert it to this format that makes sense to me, and then when I send you something to send back to their API, just use those stupid property names. Now let's think about what we should actually be validating. So I think the obvious one really is user data. You know, we can't necessarily trust that our users aren't trying to attack us. We can't, and sometimes our users don't actually know exactly what they need to send. So we need to validate that whatever they're sending is usable for us. Similarly, third-party APIs. I'm terrible for this, but you know, it's a very common thing that devs aren't really good at maintaining docs. I'm sure we've all worked with APIs where they say they're going to send one thing, and then that's not quite true. A couple of other examples. JSON.parse. This is for like reading a JSON file, for example, but it doesn't just apply to JSON. So you might, for example, be reading a CSV. It's always useful, I think, to do this, particularly if there's a chance that in the time between you starting your application and you actually reading that file, some process somewhere might have modified it. And yeah, with regards to CSVs, like often I'll use this, even if I'm very confident that I know what the CSV contains. It's nice to validate it and throw an error if I'm wrong, but I also then get the TypeScript benefits of auto-completion. And then local storage and cookies, you know, these are things that can also be modified externally. Just because we've written something to local storage doesn't mean that our user or an extension in their browser hasn't rewritten it. And then I'm sure there are more examples, but one thing that I really wanted to cover, was excited to cover, is environment variables, because I don't think this is necessarily obvious. So I'm sure most of us here have worked on a project, maybe we've not touched it in 6 months, and we suddenly need to test a PR for a colleague. And it's maybe the testing process is really long. Halfway through the steps, suddenly it blows up because our environment variables are misconfigured. If we validate our environment variables at startup, then it just saves a bit of frustration. And it also means that with TypeScript, we don't have to put exclamation marks everywhere to say, yes, I promise this is set. So this is an example of what validating environment variables might look like. You might have a database, and then maybe this is an example from my work. We've got a separate analytics server that sometimes we want to run locally, but we don't want to have to run that every time that we're actually working on our app. So the API key and URL are optional. But we can actually make this more advanced. So this schema, what it's saying, or it's telling TypeScript, what it's telling us, is that if in my environment variable I have said that the analytics server is enabled, then my API key and URL will be set. If it's not enabled, and if I haven't said whether it's enabled or not, I'll assume that it's not, then the API key and URL are optional. And then you can put in that database URL back in. Zod has a nice AND helper that just lets us merge schemas together. So let's stop looking at code for a little bit. I thought there'd be more code today, but hopefully someone appreciates looking at code here. So let's look at the ecosystem a little bit, because we can use Zod in our own code, but where else can we use it? So my team started building MCP tools for our internal tools at the beginning of this year, because there's a big push at Shopify for everybody to really use AI, take advantage of it more and more. And yeah, this means that everybody at Shopify can now use our tools from Claude, from Pi, from Cursor, if they're still on that, wherever they currently work. And what we can do with the MCP tools is through the SDK, the Zod schema can be used to inform the agent actually what data it's expecting. Astro, so if any of you build sites in Astro at all, they can use Zod schemas to actually validate the data from your content. TanStack Form, there are actually a few different examples of form libraries. What this is really cool, what is cool about this is that you can get type-safe form builders essentially that also run the same validation on both your server and your front end. So if a user doesn't have JavaScript enabled, they can get the same validation experience after the fact just from your server. And vtest, this is actually something I bumped into last week. They have built-in schema matches that support Zod. So if we zoom out once again, let's think about the actual ecosystem of validation tools. So I'd say in the Node ecosystem, these are the three big competitors, if you like, at the moment: Zod, Valibot, and Archetype. Valibot is, looks kind of similar, but it's a bit more performance-focused than Zod. It does tree shaking a bit better. I don't think it has quite as advanced an API as Zod, but if you're really concerned about performance, which, depending on what you're working on, most people probably should be, then you might want to reach for Valibot instead. And then Archetype allows us to define our schemas as strings, which I think is a bit more like the traditional approach. And it tries to approach things so that you're writing them much more like TypeScript types and interfaces in general. So that's that. Now, if we zoom out a little bit further, the authors of those tools actually developed a standard called Standard Schema. So the idea behind this is any new validation library can implement Standard Schema, and then whichever tool you like, if it supports Standard Schema, it supports your tool. And so as an example, vtest, which I mentioned earlier, that supports all three of the validation libraries that I was describing because it just implements the Standard Schema API. And that's everything that I really got to say today. So if you're interested in taking a look at this talk or anything, you can visit my site, lodave.dev. If you go to the talks page, you'll be able to find a copy of this talk. If you want to look at anything else on my site, I mainly just blog about Shopify, Liquid, and Astra. Don't know how many people here are interested in that. Thank you very much.